All right, let's think about, that's right, you can come on through here. Let's think about Revelation 8 through 11. But before we get there, let's just rehearse a couple of things. Many of you are new in the class, so let's kind of go back for just a second. Basically, my understanding of Revelation is that it was written before the year 70. And we'll see a couple of lines on that if we get to that today in Revelation 8, 9, and 10. Before 70, but that it primarily refers to the destruction of Jerusalem, and is therefore an expansion of what we have in Matthew 24, verses 3 through 34. So if you look at Matthew 24, you'll see that Jesus gives signs, and the question was, when shall these things be? That is the destruction of the temple that he had pointed to. When shall these things be? What shall the sign where these things come about? That's the questions that they have according to Mark and Luke. And Matthew adds the end of the world, which is the end of the age, which apparently they thought that would be the end of any kind of Jewish age that they were aware of, but they didn't really have in mind the end of the world as we think of it. They were thinking about the destruction of the temple and the holy city, which they thought would be lasting forever. So Jesus gives them what we might call remote signs, and then he gives nearer signs, and then he says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, written by Daniel the prophet, let him that reads understands. Then he says, let them that are in the city flee to the mountains. And so the reason is, of course, because, as Luke puts it, the city of Jerusalem would be compassed with armies, destruction was at hand. So that's how Matthew 24 lays out. I believe Revelation is simply an expansion of that, and we spent about 6 or 7 class periods at the first establishing how and why that is the case. In this particular segment, 8 through 11 of Revelation, we'll see a little bit of that also. So that's the general view of Revelation. In other words, Revelation is not written to people that are far off in other countries and other climes and other times, referring to something that will take place that had nothing to do with the people to whom he was writing. And he specifically addresses those 7 churches of Asia, and that's what we have in chapter 2. Matter of fact, chapter 2 and 3. So that's what we have, Revelation 1, 2, and 3, introduction to the book. So then we have the breakdown this way. After the revelation to the 7 churches, that is the message to the 7 churches, then we do have a very clear outline of the impending disaster to come upon Judaism as Judaism was wiped out and would be no more. So that's 4 through 11. So here's how it breaks down. We have chapters 4 and 5 is simply the commission of the Lamb. It's a lengthy statement that John gives us. He's in heaven, but this is all figures of speech. It's all apocalyptic language in which he is in vision in heaven. He sees Christ, and Christ has in his right hand, or there is going to be a book in his right hand, and it's a book that is sealed by 7 seals. That would be a scroll rolled up, sealed by 7 seals. So as the book of Revelation puts it, it's almost like, okay, we say, well, turn one page to the other, but that's not how they did it. They unsealed a seal. You had to unseal all 7 of them to unscroll it. But as he undoes each, unfastens each seal, there is a vision, something taking place. And all of it is in a building up in dramatic fashion, just like it would be in a television show, you know, where things build up to a climax. And that's exactly what we have. So we have first seal open, and the action begins in chapter 6. That's when the book begins to be opened. So everything from Revelation 1 through 3, 7 churches, 4 and 5, the vision of Christ in heaven. Here he's going to tell us what's going to happen. Now we have the action beginning, chapter 6. Chapter 6 has all the seals, or most of the seals open, not all of them yet. We have 6 of the seals that are open here, and they're all parallel to what we have in Matthew 24. But before we have the final seal opened, chapter 7 is given to us, in which is a pause in the action. So you just go and hit the pause button on your VHS or on your DVD, and you hit the pause button. And he says, okay, before we finish this up, I want you to know that the people of God are going to be sealed on their foreheads. And he tells us about the 144,000. Not literally, not understood to be people with marks on their head, but it is the idea of God's people are protected And those are the individuals that will be not simply 144,000, but he tells us, chapter 7, verses 9 and 10, that there are many others also from many language, peoples, and nations also that are sealed. That is Christian people. All right, so that's God's marking his people. Now we're ready for chapters 8 through 11, in which we have the seventh seal is about to be opened, and it is opened in chapter 8 and verse 1. So you see how it opens up. Now I had a page that I wanted to hand out to you, but I neglected to bring it. And I apologize for that because I was going to have a handout. I just didn't get it done, but I'll give it to you next week. So chapter 8, let's just glance at chapter 8 where we pick up the material here. And before we begin, let's just mention this. Do you have any question about anything that we've laid out thus far? If you have an objection, that's fine. I'm not here to say, okay, be quiet, listen to what I have to say, and so forth. That's not my modus operandi. That's not how we're going to do it. If you have a question, if you have an objection, if you have anything at all, that's fine to say. Say, okay, how about this? How about that? So anything at all. Thus far. All right. Some of you have taken good, careful notes, and I'm appreciative of that. I hope that we're studying. I was telling Nita on the way over here that Thomas Campbell, that was Alexander Campbell's father, was a preacher in old Ireland, and he would go around twice a year to visit every person in the church. But it was not just visitation. Here's how they visited. He was a Presbyterian preacher at the time. He said he would go to the house and he would test them on their Bible knowledge. And he said, I'm going to ask you a few questions, and I want you to answer what the answers are. And then also, what is your daily Bible reading like? How do you read in your Bible daily? They're interested in people's spiritual growth. Now, he was interested also in having face-to-face with people and helping people out. But they were interested in what you know on the Bible, so he'd go and say, here's what we're going to do. How do you like that idea? We're going to come around, we'll just say, you've been reading your Bible daily. And you know what? A lot of times preachers don't have to ask. You don't have to ask, do you? No. Just the same as if I stand up to preach and I know who's with me and who's not. I know who's with me and who's not. I know it, don't you, Bruce? You can tell when someone's with you or not. You can tell when someone's putting their arm on the side of the pew and listening, and I say, okay, let's open your Bibles. And it's like, man, I don't even have my Bible. And they just and that goes week after week after week. You know who's with you? So that's the way they did it. So this is important that we have a daily Bible study. We have a bunch of studiers in here, and that's really good. So in chapter 8, the seventh seal is about to be opened, and he tells us that right up front. So when he opened the seventh seal, there followed a silence in heaven about the space of a half hour. I saw 7 angels that stand before God, and there were given unto them 7 trumpets. So what's happening here is he is breaking down, as we have right here on the chart, the 7 seals is now going to be subdivided into 7 trumpets. That's all that's taking place here. It simply is building up anticipation with a crescendo. 7 seals open. What's about to happen? Now we're going to break it down into 7 trumpets, 7 trumpet blasts. And that's all that's happening here. So in chapter 8, it goes all the way through chapter 11 and verse 19. You'll notice the 7 trumpets that are blasting. The last trumpet is given to us in chapter 11 in verse 15. You see this? Just flip over to 11 and 15. The 7th angel sounded. There followed great voices in heaven. That's the 7th trumpet sounding. So all 7 trumpets blast and things occur. But once again, there's going to be a pause in the action as he presents it throughout. So that's how it is laid open. And the climax in chapter 11 is the destruction of the temple. And he tells us that in chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. This is the temple. And he said this is going to be measured. And then we have in verse 8 of chapter 11, it's the temple in the city of Jerusalem. This is one reason we understand this to be a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem. He's measuring the temple for destruction, and then he tells us it's the very city where our Lord was crucified, verse 8. Very simple, laid out that way. So that's how the 7 trumpets are blasting. The 7 trumpets give us the action as it progresses. So any question on that thus far? So what I did was, that's the second half of Revelation is simply a duplication, just a dual vision, another vision with different figures, basically laying out the same thing. Just like Joseph, remember, had two visions, two dreams that were, one was of the sheaves of wheat, bowing down to his sheaf of wheat. Then he had a dream about stars, and he was the moon, and the stars bowed down to him. And the two visions, duplicate. Same thing with Pharaoh. Pharaoh had two dreams, but the message was the same. So exactly in Revelation. So let's go on to a couple of things here regarding this particular portion. So let's think about Revelation 8 to 11, how it is laid out. And this was what I had on the paper for you that I neglected to bring, but this is how it lays out. This is the seventh trumpet. So we have the angels blasting trumpets, and here's what we have. So the overview, we've just talked about the overview of it. There's an interlude. So what is an interlude? It's an intermission. I said we're going to hit a pause button, and that begins in chapter 10 and verse 1. So just glance at it quickly. The pause button on the action happens at 10 and 1. And here we have a beautiful description of an angel, a strong angel coming down out of heaven. In my personal estimation, I believe it's a reference to Jesus Christ himself, simply because of the description that is given here of the strong angel, which matches what we have in Revelation chapter 1. I don't know that. We don't have that information here, but that's my understanding that this is a reference to Christ. So what he announces, we have the angel, the trumpets that have been blasting. The sixth angel has already sounded the trumpet. That's back to 9 and 13. But now the pause on the action, and he tells us in verse 6, there shall be delay no longer. Delay in what? Delay in the final catastrophe that would come upon the Jews. But in the days of the voice of the seventh angel, he tells us, this is verse 7, when he is about to sound, then is finished the mystery of God, according to the good tidings which he declared to his servants, the prophets. What was declared to his servants, the prophets, in the Old Testament regarding destructive power? It was always referring to the destruction of Judaism, the destruction of the city. For example, Daniel chapter 9, quoted by our Lord in Matthew 24, referring to the destruction of the city. So this is what the apostles, or rather the prophets of the Old Testament, had in mind. So we'll have a delay no more. Now the action is going to absolutely conclude. And so that's what we have. So at the very end of it, he says, take this book and eat it up, and it shall make your belly bitter, in your mouth it shall be sweet as honey. All right, but we're moving ahead a little bit too far. So then we have, finally, the lesson is the temple of God is in heaven. That's the conclusion of it. So there's the four things from chapter 8 to 11. The temple of God is in heaven, chapter 11, verse 19. It's not on the earth. We don't have an earthly temple. It's in heaven. So that's how it lines out. But I want to think about this interlude, because number 3 says, during the interlude, there are 4 things that happen. Now, interlude means the pause in the action. Perhaps before we get to that, let's notice the 7 trumpets blasting and see what they have to say. This is beginning chapter 8, and we'll see it beginning in verse 1. So we have, for example, the setup of it is verses 1 through 6 of chapter 8. When he opened the 7th seal, silence in heaven about half hour, 7 angels given 7 trumpets. Another angel stood over the altar having a golden censer. He had much incense, and he would add to it the prayers of the saints. Verse 4, the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints went up before God out of the angel's hand. Literal? No, these are figures of speech, apocalyptic figures. The angel takes the censer, he fills it with the fire from the altar, and casts it upon the earth. What does that mean? Here's the destruction. This is the destruction. So the censer's cast. What is a censer? That's the little canister that they had where they put the hot coals and then they put the incense in it. That was the smoke surrounding the altar, and here's the angel casting it on the earth. Yes, sir?
Is this also the answer to the saints' prayer?
I think that it all is indeed an answer to the saints' prayers. That would be in the 5th seal. That would be in chapter 6 and verse 9 when they said, "How long, Lord?" Which really is a good point. I'm glad you brought that out. So if you go back to chapter 6, when you open the fifth seal, so now we're going back from the trumpets to the seals. I don't want to be confusing on that point. Remember, the book was given to Christ, closed by 7 seals. He opens each seal in order. And then we have the fifth seal, and he saw souls under the altar, those that had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus. And he says, they cry, "How long, O Master, holy and true, do you not avenge our blood upon the earth?" So how long are you going to wait until you avenge our blood? They've been martyred. They've been murdered for Christ. He tells them then, verse 11, "You should rest for a little time until their fellow servants and their brethren should also be killed. And then they should have fulfilled their course." It's going to be just a little bit more. So in answer to that, how long, that's what we have in the answer to that prayer. For example, in 10 and verse 6, "There shall be delay no longer." And now back in chapter 8, this is the answer to that prayer, casting the censer upon the earth. I think it's a good point, Bruce. So we have the 7 angels, had the 7 trumpets. We're back in 8 and 6 now. 8 and 6. And they sounded. The first sounded. What do we have? Okay, we have hail, fire, mingled with blood. They were cast on the earth. Third part of the earth was burnt up. This is simply language that we find from Ezekiel. Remember, all of this material comes from the Old Testament, also utilized in the New, and it refers to the destruction that would come upon the peoples, Israel particularly. If you look at Luke 21 and verse 31, start at verse 20, Luke 21 and verse 20, he tells us, "When you see Jerusalem encompassed with armies, you know that her desolation is at hand." And then he tells us in verse 25, regarding that destructive event, "There shall be signs upon in the sun, moon, and stars, upon the earth, distress of nations, perplexity for the roaring of the sea and the billows." What's he talking about? Well, he goes down and tells you, this generation will not pass away until all of these things are accomplished, verse 32. And he's answering the question, how about the city of Jerusalem? How about the temple? That's what he's talking about. But he uses language, it sounds like the entire globe is on fire. But it's referring to the destruction of the city and Judaism itself. Because he tells us this generation will not pass away till all of these things are accomplished. That is, it would be in the lifetime of those people then living that these things would occur. That's Luke 21. And that's verse 32. Same thing in Matthew 24, verse 34. So I take it that we have exactly the same thing here. And now, let me just stop here and say, this is why I thought it was important to present in 6 lessons at the beginning, or 7, however many we had, to give us the time frame, to give us a framework in which to understand these things. And this is language that is very common in the Old Testament prophets, referring to the destruction of nations. So you have it in Ezekiel chapter 35, for example. You'll have the same type of language that is given, but he's not referring to the globe being on fire. He's referring to nations that are being destroyed. And you'll find that in Isaiah. You'll find that in Jeremiah, Ezekiel, particularly in Daniel. So that's the first angel that sounds, verse 7. Second angel, he says there was a great mountain burning with fire cast into the sea, and third part of the sea became blood. Now what figures of speech is he using here, or where do they come from the Old Testament? Rivers became blood. Where does that come from? I'm not giving you the answer. Huh? Moses, right. Egypt. So that's a good point. So here we have, John utilizes, he's not saying this is the fulfillment of anything. He simply takes all the figures from the Old Testament, many of them from Daniel and many of them from Exodus, and he just reworks them and utilizes those figures of speech. And he utilizes them, and so you'll find throughout the book of Revelation, 98% of the book of Revelation is simply Old Testament material reworked. That's all he's doing. So you recognize these figures. He's not saying this is the fulfillment of any such thing. He said, this is what happened here, but I'm going to use that, and here we go. Okay, the rivers are turning to blood. And that's what we have in the second trumpet that it sounds. Does that make sense? Say again. Huh? Yeah, he's joking. Yeah, he's utilizing. That's right. It is great literature. If you, matter of fact, just tapping off what Nita said, it's great literature. If you go back to read, for example, the Shakespeares of the world, or people such as that, they're going to, you'll understand the literature that they use. They use a lot of figures of speech, or Milton's Paradise Lost. It's not, you're not going to say, okay, what's he talking about, literal? These are all figures of speech that are used to give us a sense of destructive power. And that's the idea. So let's go to the second angel. That's the mountain. We've done that one. The third one is verse 10. And it fell from heaven a great star, burning as a torch. It fell upon the third of the rivers and the fountains and waters. And the name of the star is called wormwood. That would be simply bitterness. And the waters became wormwood. Many of them died of the waters because they were made bitter. What is this? He's expanding the figures of speech to give us a sense of real destructive power that would come upon Israel. Or we have the fourth angel, the sun was smitten, and third part of the moon, third part of the stars. Then we have verse 13, an eagle flying in mid-heaven, saying with a great voice, woe, woe, woe for them that dwell on the earth, by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the three angels who are about to sound. So then we have the fifth angel, chapter 9 and verse 1. What happens here? And once again, I just say this because so many people in the religious community are addicted to the idea that these things must be literal, actual things and not symbolic. And John tells us at chapter 1, verse 1, it's all in signs, all in symbols. He tells you that, chapter 1 and 1. He tells you that in chapter 22 at the very end of the book. All in signs and symbols. So let's remind ourselves of that when he says this star fell from heaven onto the earth, and given to him the key of the pit of the abyss. What's that? That's of course the land of the dead. Apparently, he opened the pit of the abyss, went up smoke out of the pit, smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And out of the smoke came forth locusts on the earth. Now, all right, let's stop here. Locusts on the earth, power given to them as scorpions that on the earth that have power. All right, where do we see that symbology in the Old Testament? We remember all of these things come out of the Old. Where do we find a locust plague in the prophets that are going to destroy portions of the land? Joel. Is it what Joel, particularly chapter 1 and chapter 2. What is John doing here? Utilizing great literature, not plagiarizing, great literature. He's going back and reaching over and bringing these figures over to give us a sense of destruction. How did Joel mean it in Joel chapters 1 and 2? When he talked about the locust plagues that are coming upon the earth, he's talking about the armies of Babylon that are coming, but he calls them locusts. Now, why? That's symbology. And that's how he does it in Joel 1 and 2. So remember that one? So you probably read Joel last night at your bedtime reading. You said, I remember that easily. That's what Joel talked about. Yes, sir. I don't know. We're not told that. I think these are, that's a good way to put it, literary devices. I was going to say window dressing, literary devices to give us a vivid picture. And I think, and this is my opinion, I think when we descend into the details such as like, who's the star, who's the wormwood, who's this, I think we're actually destroying the purpose for which it was written. And that's my thinking on it, personal opinion. We could spend all day talking, how do the locusts have breastplates? How is it that they have tails like scorpions? Well, okay, now do we know any army that has a tail like scorpion? Well, we're taking great literature and we're descending down into details that were not intended to be understood in a literal sense. And it's only trying to give you a sharp picture of something that's about to occur. Now, that's my opinion on how the whole thing is composed. Now, if you have a different idea, I'm happy to hear you on it.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am, that's great.
So where do the denominations get the word rapture? Where does that come from?
Okay, the word rapture does not occur in the Bible. It is not a New Testament word at all. The idea is not there either, that people will be taken away and the other people will be left on the earth. That is read into the Bible, but the word rapture does not occur. So we don't have that anywhere in here. That would be the same thing regarding the word Antichrist, all right? A lot of people and a lot of commentators talk about, all right, let's find the Antichrist in Revelation. Which passage are you going to turn to in the book of Revelation to find Antichrist? You're not. He's not mentioned. And matter of fact, there's not a he that is an Antichrist. 1 John chapter 2 tells us, you might just turn over there to it. I don't mean to go off on too many rabbit trails here. But 1 John chapter 2 tells us regarding Antichrists, and he tells us very plainly what that means. So this is chapter 2, beginning verse 18, 1 John, just a couple of books back. Little children, it is the last hour. All right, what is he talking about, last hour?
Final age.
Final time, and he's talking about the final hour. Obviously, you know, in the New Testament you have frequent comments such as upon whom the end of the ages has come. What would that be? That would be the New Testament period. New Testament period. The last days, Peter said, began right now in Acts chapter 2. And that would be the final period. In the last hour here, he says, all right, you've heard that Antichrist comes. Even now have there risen many Antichrists, whereby you know that it's the last hour. They went out from us, they were not of us, and he goes on with that one right there. Then he says, who's the liar but he that denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist. That's verse 22. This is the Antichrist, even he that denies the Father and the Son. Whosoever denies the Son, the same has not the Father. He that confesses the Son has the Father also. From that information, what would you conclude about Antichrist? Number one, there's not one individual that's an Antichrist, but there are many Antichrists. Number two, they were already in the world in John's day. Number three, they are those who deny the lordship of Jesus Christ. It's possible there are many Antichrists, and there are today in principle, but they were also in his day. So there's not one individual. So that's one of those things that the Antichrist, the Bible doesn't speak about the Antichrist, no more than it talks about the rapture. All right, any other comments, any other questions on that? Yes, sir. Yeah, well, that would be, okay, so this is Matthew 24, and he's in verse 40 and 41, actually.
41.
So,
If I've understood correctly, the biblical meaning is one of the men will recognize the sign that Jerusalem is about to be destroyed and will flee, but one will be left behind. That's my understanding.
okay, my thinking on the subject is the following. They ask about two things. When shall these things be? He just said the city of Jerusalem will be destroyed, the temple. That would mean something to them. The temple being destroyed, because that's the center and heart of their religion. It's not like the church building's destroyed, nothing at all the same. Nothing at all. Don't even equate it to the church building is destroyed. Nothing to do with that. The temple destroyed means the religion is gone. Why? Because you have to go to the temple to sacrifice, and all Jewish males had to attend there 3 times a year. The temple being destroyed, that was Judaism gone. And that's what he said.
Sacrifices were directly connected to the forgiveness of sin.
That's right. So they had to go to the temple. It was part of the religious mandates, commandments that they had. And God put his name in Jerusalem. So when he said the temple's destroyed, no, that is Judaism itself would be destroyed. It'd be like saying Christianity is going to be destroyed. So that's what the intent was here. So they were puzzled by that. And they asked two questions. When shall these things be? What shall be the sign when these things are about to occur? And he gives them all these signs. But he goes down to verse 34 and he says, this generation shall not pass away till all of these things are accomplished. Okay. Now, I've heard people say, well, let's take some of these things about, the love of many waxing cold. That sounds like something today. Well, there are parallels today, but that's not what he was referring to. All right, at verse 34, I believe that he changes here now, speaking about the second coming of Christ, which they were not aware of, which they did not even anticipate. They did not yet even believe he was leaving the earth, did they? They didn't even know. They didn't know that the Lord was leaving. They didn't know he was going to be crucified, resurrected, ascend to the heavens. They had no idea about that. That was out of their computer system. But I believe that he's referring to those events when he tells us, verse 35, heaven and earth shall pass away, my word shall not pass away, but of that day and of that hour knows no one, not the angels of heaven, neither the Son, but the Father only. What day? Well, not a day they were thinking about, but he's speaking, of course, for generations to come. And he tells us, as it was in the days of Noah, they'll be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. Those days before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. They knew not that the flood came. So shall it be the coming of the Son of Man. What coming? The coming in the destruction of Jerusalem? No, he just told the Christians, get out when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies. Now he says, here's the coming of the Lord. They don't even anticipate it. No one knows it's coming. And he says he doesn't even know when the day would be. And then in that context, he tells us, there shall be two men in the field, one is taken, one is left. Two women grinding in the mill, one is taken, one is left. Watch, you don't know the day nor the hour, or the day that the Lord comes. And that is the time. Mark 13:33 tells us the same thing. So, verse 44, be ready in an hour that you think not, the Son of Man comes. I believe he's referring to the second coming of Christ, in my view, which they were not anticipating. There's no question about that. But it's written not just for those people at that time. It was for ages to come. So that's my understanding about that one. And then as he goes into the next chapters, he gives us three parables regarding it. And those three parables are starting in verse 45 of Matthew 24. That is, here's a servant, or here's a householder who is beating his servants. And he was not ready for the Lord to come. He was just living his life as he wanted to live. Same thing in Matthew 25, verse 1. The kingdom of heaven shall be likened to 10 virgins who took the lamps, went forth to meet the bridegroom. Then he tells us 5 were wise, 5 were foolish. They were not ready. Then he gives us verse 14 of chapter 25, parable of the talents. What are you to do in waiting for the Lord? He said it will be a long time before the Lord comes. In this instance, he tells us that in verse 19 of chapter 25. Now, after a long time, the Lord of those servants comes, and he makes a reckoning with the servants. Does that sound like anything that we've read about the destruction of Jerusalem when he says, when you see the signs, get out of the city? No. No, he's coming to make a reckoning, and that's the second coming of Christ. Now, that's my understanding of how the material breaks down. All right, Ann, any questions? She's looking at me like, let's go back over that again. Now, if you have any question, if I go too quickly, slow me down. Okay. 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 So Matthew 25, or rather I should say Matthew 24, divides into two different comings of the Lord. Coming at the destruction of Jerusalem and coming the second final coming, which is still future. As a matter of fact, we'll have a debate on that very issue coming up in August right here at the building with those who deny the second coming of Christ, the future. They say, no, it's all happened already and we're now in heaven. Huh? No, you're already there. What do you mean when's it to be? You're already there. This is it. Oh, August, okay. August 12 and 13, I think, or 11 and 12, second weekend in August. His name is Holger Neubauer.
It's a Friday and Saturday.
Friday and Saturday, but anyway. So any questions on any of that material? Which is it?
11 and 12.
11 and 12, okay.
11 at 6 and the 12 at 1 and 5.
Okay, yeah, well, we just got it set up because I was supposed to go somewhere else and do it in Dallas, but they wanted to charge $1,000 for me, $1,000 to him. I was like, I'm not paying to talk about error. I'm not going to pay that kind of money for a hall when we have one here. So anyway. All right, any other question on what we've talked about thus far? And I'm happy for you to slow me down, break me down, and say, okay, wait a minute, wait. Bruce.
These are a number of great punishments that God sent to the earth. Chapter 8.
Okay, you're in Revelation?
No, yeah, Revelation 8.
Okay, Revelation. Okay, so, right, these are, in my estimation, these are simply figures of speech about the destructive powers that are coming upon the city of Jerusalem. And he's given it to us in a ever-increasing line of crescendos. You have, number one, you have, for example, in verse 7, you have fire mingled with blood, earth burned up. Then you have mountain cast into the sea, waters became blood. Third angel, star, wormwood. Fourth angel, the sun, smitten. And then these are simply an increasing line of crescendo figures of speech. So we have the same thing when we come down to chapter 9 and verse 1. And when we have this one opened up, back to where we were, you have this huge army of locusts that have tails like scorpions. Well, here's something else interesting. He tells them, this is the command given to them, verse 4 of chapter 9, that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, nor any tree, but only such men as have not the seal on their foreheads, all right? Where does that go to? What chapter? He's already talked about the seal. Where was that? Chapter 7, 144,000 plus the great multitude that no man can number, sealed on their foreheads, protective custody of God. And so that's what we have. These armies are coming, and they're going to spare those who have the seal of God on their forehead. They're not going to hurt them at that point. And it was given to them they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months. And the torment was a torment of a scorpion as it strikes a man. And in these days men shall seek death and shall no wise find it. At Jerusalem, when they surrounded the city, that's exactly what the Jews were doing. They were seeking death. It was probably, Josephus words it so colorfully, if not so graphically and horrifically. It was probably the most destructive event that they had seen in the world up to that point, when almost 1 million Jews trapped in the city, and they were eating one another, trying to escape the city, and they would swallow the gold and try to get out of the city. So a lot of the Jews had gold, and they would try to escape, and the Romans caught them, and they discovered that they were swallowing the gold, and so they would rip them open and get the gold out. It's just, because they swallowed the gold hoping they would pass it in their excrement later. That's how they would do it. They would swallow the gold so they come out and they'd have their riches. So they were pretty tied to it, but that's what was going on in the city of Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, they stripped the entire country roundabout of trees, building crosses for those Jews. And today, if you go to Israel, which we plan to do this fall, Lord willing, the areas around it are barren of trees. But it happened from that day when they stripped that area of trees, making crosses for these Jews they caught running out of the city. But what are you going to do? I mean, so anyway, the stories are very graphic, and this is, I think, a pictorial directory of how that's going to take place. That's my understanding of what's happening. Now, I didn't go as far as I wanted to go, but so we're going to look at the interlude next week. We'll look at this interlude, and I want you to, and I'll have a handout for you on that so you can take notes on it. So there's the trumpets, and here's the interlude, just as a Greek tragedy, And here are 4 things that happen in that interlude. That will be, which starts in chapter 10 and verse 1. There's a pause in the action. And he said, here's 4 things happen. Number 1, mighty angel come down from heaven. John eats a little book. Literal? No, not literal at all. But he says, it's sweet in my mouth, in my belly it's bitter. Measure the temple of God. And then the 2 witnesses. Who are these 2 witnesses? And when we get into some of that, there's so many opinions regarding it, but I'll give you my ideas on it. And not that my word is the final, obviously, but I'll give you what I think to be the case on that. But we do know that we have the destruction of the city and Jerusalem in chapter 11 and the destruction of the temple, which is exactly what we have in Matthew 24. All right, any other thoughts? Any thoughts on it at all? Okay. Looks like you're pursing your mouth like, I want to ask it, but I'm not going to say anything. But if you want to, that's fine. Okay, last chance. All right, thank you for your participation.